To understand the sheer magnitude of the financial catastrophe that engulfed the Kingdom of France in the early 18th century, one must first understand the crushing weight of the silence that fell over the Palace of Versailles on the morning of September 1st in 1715. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who had declared "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state," was dead. His heart, which had beaten for France for 72 years, had stopped, and with it, the artificial heartbeat of the French economy. The king left behind a legacy of absolute grandeur, visible in the Hall of Mirrors and the sprawling gardens of his palace, but he also left behind a ledger of absolute ruin. The cost of his endless wars, particularly the War of the Spanish Succession, which had dragged on from 1701 to 1714, had bled the nation white. When the royal accountants finally dared to open the books in the autumn of 1715, the numbers were the stuff of nightmares. The national debt of France stood at roughly 3 billion livres. To a modern ear, that number might sound abstract, so let us contextualize it. The total annual revenue of the French government, every tax, every tariff, every duty collected from the English Channel to the Mediterranean, amounted to only 145 million livres. The disparity was mathematical suicide. The interest payments alone on the existing debt were practically equal to the entire revenue of the state. The government of France was not just broke, it was insolvent 20 times over. The economic paralysis was total. The king had issued paper billets d'état, state notes, to pay for his wars when the gold ran out. These notes were technically promises to pay, but by 1715 the public had lost all faith in the word of the crown. These notes traded on the black market at a discount of 80% or more. A merchant holding a government promise for 100 livres would be lucky to sell it for 20 livres in hard coin. Because the currency was broken, trade had stopped. Ships sat rotting in the harbors of Nantes and Bordeaux. Fields lay fallow because farmers could not buy seed. The peasantry, the backbone of the nation, were eating grass and bark in the provinces, while the aristocracy in Paris debated which jewels to sell to pay their servants. The heir to the throne, Louis XV, was a sickly child of only 5 years old. The fate of the greatest power in Europe rested in the hands of the regent, the Duke of Orleans. The Duke was a man of contradictions. He was brilliant, an atheist, a debauchee of legendary proportions who held orgies at the Palais Royal, but he was also genuinely concerned for the welfare of the kingdom. He looked at the financial wreckage and saw no way out. He convened councils of finance. He fired the controllers general. He even instituted a Chambre de Justice, a terrifying tribunal that dragged 4,410 financiers and tax collectors before judges to explain their wealth. It was a witch hunt for money. The government seized roughly 220 million livres from these wealthy targets, sending many to the dungeon or the galleys, but it was a drop in the ocean. The debt remained. The regent began to whisper about the only option left, a total national bankruptcy. He would simply declare that the king's debts died with the king. It would destroy the credit of France for a century, but it would clear the books. It was at this precise moment of hopelessness that a shadow crossed the threshold of the Palais Royal. John Law had arrived. To call John Law a banker is to call Napoleon a soldier. It is true, but it misses the scale of the man. Born in Edinburgh in 1671, the son of a goldsmith, Law was a mathematical prodigy and a fugitive. In 1694, living the high life in London, the 23-year-old Law had been challenged to a duel by a dandy named Edward Bow Wilson. The dispute was allegedly over the affections of a woman, Elizabeth Villiers, though rumors persisted that Law was actually a spy or a hired assassin. In the misty dawn of Bloomsbury Square, Law drew his sword and killed Wilson with a single thrust to the chest. He was arrested, tried at the Old Bailey, and sentenced to hang for murder. But John Law was not a man to be contained by stone walls. A few days before his execution, he drugged his guards, filed through the bars of his cell, scaled a 30-foot wall, and vanished into the fog. He fled to the continent, becoming a man without a country. For the next 20 years, he wandered the great cities of Europe, Amsterdam, Venice, Genoa, Paris. He did not idle. He spent his nights at the gambling tables, where his uncanny ability to calculate odds in his head allowed him to amass a fortune. He didn't play luck, he played probability. But by day, he haunted the banks and the bourses. He studied the Bank of Amsterdam, noticing how they used paper receipts to represent gold stored in the vaults. He realized a profound truth that no one else in Europe quite grasped. Money was not the gold itself. Money was the confidence that the gold existed. He wrote a treatise, Money and Trade, considered in 1705, arguing that a nation's power depended not on how much metal it hoarded, but on the velocity of its trade. He believed that paper money, backed by land or the state, could liberate an economy from the chains of gold shortages. He preached that credit was the blood of the body politic. He offered his services to the King of Sicily, the Duke of Savoy, and even the old Louis XIV. But he was always rejected as a dangerous theorist, a Protestant, and a murderer. But the Duke of Orleans was desperate, and desperate men listened to dangerous ideas. Law and the Duke had met years earlier in a gambling den and had formed an unlikely friendship. Now, with France on the brink of collapse, the regent summoned the Scotsman. Law laid out his plan. It was seductive in its simplicity. He would create a bank that would issue paper notes. These notes would be used to pay taxes. Because they were required for taxes, they would have value. He would use the deposits to lend money to merchants at low interest rates, restarting the heart of the economy. The regent agreed. On May 2, 1716, the government issued a patent allowing Law to establish the Banque Générale. It was set up in Law's own mansion in the Place Louis-le-Grand. It was the first central bank in the history of a major nation-state, though it started as a private enterprise. Law played his hand perfectly. He knew the French didn't trust paper money, so he made a guarantee. His banknotes were redeemable for a fixed weight of silver écus of the coinage of the day. This was a masterstroke. The royal government was notorious for debasement, calling in gold coins, melting them down, mixing in base metals, and reissuing them with the same face value but less gold. It was a hidden tax. Law's notes, however, were immune to this. They were a store of value superior to the king's own coin. Trust returned. Merchants began to demand payment in Law's paper. The trade velocity increased. The patient, France, began to breathe again. At first, the shares moved slowly. The memory of previous failed trading companies was fresh, but Law was a master of what we today would call hype. He launched a propaganda campaign that would rival any modern advertising agency. He didn't sell the reality of Louisiana, which was a swamp-filled, mosquito-infested wilderness where settlers died of yellow fever and dysentery. He sold the dream of Louisiana. He hired illustrators to produce engravings showing the Mississippi River flowing with gold dust. He circulated stories of the Emerald Rock of Arkansas, a legendary mountain of green gems waiting to be mined. He depicted the Native Americans not as potential threats, but as eager trading partners holding out trays of silver ingots. To populate his colony, he needed bodies. Law emptied the prisons of Paris. He offered freedom to convicts if they would marry a prostitute from the La Salpêtrière asylum and board a ship to New Orleans. In 1718, the city of New Orleans was founded, named in honor of Law's patron, the Duke of Orleans. It was a collection of mud huts in a cypress swamp, but in the brochures circulating in Paris, it was depicted as a burgeoning metropolis of stone cathedrals and busy ports. The turning point came in 1719. Law, now emboldened by the regent's absolute trust, moved to consolidate the entire French economy under his control. In May 1719, he merged the Company of the West with the Company of the East Indies and the Company of China. He renamed the conglomerate the Compagnie des Indes, but everyone simply called it the Mississippi Company. He now controlled the trade with America, Africa, and Asia. He had a monopoly on tobacco. In July 1719, he purchased the royal mint for 50 million livres, giving him the right to strike the king's coin. In August 1719, he outbid the prestigious fermiers généraux, the tax farmers, and bought the right to collect all indirect taxes in France. By the autumn of 1719, John Law was not just a banker. He was the bank, the stock market, the tax collector, and the colonial governor. He was the most powerful man in Europe who did not wear a crown. To fund this massive expansion, Law issued more shares. The issuance was choreographed to create a frenzy. The first batch, known as the mère, mothers, had been sold at 500 livres. The next batch, the filles, daughters, were issued at 550 livres. The third, the petite filles, granddaughters, came out at 1,000 livres. The demand was voracious. The Rue Quincampoix, a narrow, muddy street in the 4th arrondissement of Paris, where the stock jobbers gathered, became the center of the universe. The scene described by contemporaries was one of total madness. The street was so packed with bodies that people could not move for hours. The noise was deafening. Aristocrats who had never worked a day in their lives were seen grappling in the mud with footmen and chimney sweeps to get the attention of a broker. A hunchback famously earned 150,000 livres in a few weeks by renting out his back as a writing desk for traders to sign contracts on. A cobbler whose stall was located in the street rented it out for 200 livres a day, retiring with a fortune. The social order of France was inverted. Servants became masters. Masters became beggars. One famous anecdote tells of a Madame de Begon who was at the opera when she saw a woman enter covered in diamonds that outshone her own. She asked who the lady was and was told it was her own cook who had become rich on Mississippi shares. The price of the shares defied gravity. In June 1719, they traded at 2,000 livres. By August, 5,000. By November, they broke 10,000 livres. The valuation of the Mississippi Company at its peak reached roughly 5 billion livres. To put that in perspective, this was double the amount of all the gold and silver coins in existence in France. Where did the money come from to buy these shares? It came from Law's bank. In January 1719, the Banque Générale had been nationalized as the Banque Royale. This meant the king guaranteed the notes. Law used the bank to print money to lend to investors to buy shares in his company. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing circle of inflation. The bank printed notes, the people borrowed the notes, the people bought shares, the share price went up, the people felt rich, and they borrowed more notes. The term millionaire was invented in the Rue Quincampoix in the autumn of 1719 because, for the first time, commoners were holding portfolios worth millions of livres. Paris was awash in luxury. The cloth merchants reported selling more gold braid and velvet in 3 months than they usually sold in 10 years. The carriage makers could not keep up with demand. France appeared to be the wealthiest nation on earth. But the system, as Law called it, had a fatal flaw. It relied on the belief that the shares were worth 10,000 livres based on the future profits of the Louisiana colony and the tax farms. But the colony was not producing profits. It was a drain. The tax farms were efficient, but they couldn't generate enough revenue to pay the dividends Law had promised. Law had promised a dividend of 200 livres per share. With millions of shares in circulation, the math simply didn't work. The smart money, the realizers, began to see the cliff edge approaching in late 1719. These were the cynical traders, often Law's enemies like the Paris brothers, who silently began to sell their shares at the peak. They didn't want paper banknotes, they wanted gold. They took their paper winnings to the Banque Royale and demanded hard coin, which they then packed into wagons and smuggled out of France to London and Amsterdam. The drain on the bank's gold reserves was catastrophic. Law watched the reserves dwindle with horror. He knew that if the public realized the gold was gone, the illusion would shatter. He reacted with the fury of a tyrant. In January 1720, Law was named Comptroller General of Finances, giving him absolute power. He immediately declared war on gold. He issued edicts banning the export of coin. He devalued gold coins to make them less attractive than paper. When that didn't work, he went further. In February 1720, it became illegal for any French citizen to own more than 500 livres in gold or silver coin. He unleashed a network of informers. Servants were paid to spy on their masters. Police raided the homes of the wealthy, tearing up floorboards and breaking down walls in search of hidden specie. The gold was confiscated and replaced with paper notes. It was a reign of monetary terror. For a brief moment, the share price held, artificially propped up by the fact that there was no other legal form of money. But the inflation in the real economy was now raging. With billions of livres of paper flooding the streets, the price of bread rose 300% in 6 months. A pair of shoes that cost 5 livres in 1719 cost 40 livres in May 1720. The millionaires found that their paper millions were buying less and less. The peasantry and the working class, who owned no shares but had to buy bread, were being crushed. Riots began to break out in the markets. The regent, the Duke of Orleans, began to waver in his support of Law. His advisors told him the system was unsustainable. The death knell rang on May 21st, 1720. On this day, arguably the most infamous date in financial history, John Law made a fatal calculation. He realized he could not keep the share price at 9,000 livres and the banknotes at full value. There simply wasn't enough real wealth in France to back it. He decided to induce a controlled deflation. He convinced the regent to sign an edict that would gradually reduce the value of the shares from 9,000 to 5,000 livres, and reduce the value of the banknotes by 50% over the coming months. Law thought he was being responsible, bringing the valuation back to reality. The public saw it as a robbery. The edict effectively told every citizen, half the money in your pocket is gone. The psychological contract was broken. Panic, instant and total, swept through Paris. The regent, terrified by the public outcry, revoked the edict on May 27th, only 6 days later, but it was too late. The confidence was dead. The summer of 1720 was a long, slow funeral for the French economy. In a desperate final attempt to mop up the flood of useless paper money, the government offered to convert the banknotes into perpetual annuities at a low interest rate, but few took the offer. The economy had reverted to barter. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows. No one would accept paper. The system had disintegrated. By October 1720, the shares of the Mississippi Company were effectively worthless, trading for the price of waste paper. The banknotes were demonetized. The total losses were staggering. An entire generation of wealth had been transferred and then evaporated. The old aristocracy had sold their lands to the new millionaires for paper, and now the paper was dust. The new millionaires were destitute. Suicides became a daily occurrence in Paris. The hospitals were filled with people who had gone mad from the shock of losing everything. John Law's fall was as precipitous as his rise. The regent, though he still had personal affection for Law, could no longer protect him. Law resigned his post as Comptroller General. In December 1720, under the cover of night, John Law fled France. He had arrived with a fortune. He left with almost nothing, his French estates confiscated, his shares worthless. He traveled first to Brussels, then to Venice. He spent the last 9 years of his life as he had begun them, wandering the gambling halls of Europe. a gray ghost of the man who had once owned the world. He died in Venice in 1729, leaving behind a collection of paintings and a few deck of cards. The scar that the Mississippi bubble left on France was deep and permanent. The immediate financial cleanup was brutal. The government held another visa, a massive audit to determine which debts would be honored and which would be canceled. Most of the paper wealth was simply burned, but the psychological damage was far greater. For the next 80 years, the French people held a violent, visceral distrust of banks, paper money, and stock markets. While their rival, Great Britain, adopted the financial innovations of the Bank of England, using credit to fund the Royal Navy and the Industrial Revolution, France retreated into financial conservatism. The French monarchy was forced to rely on an antiquated system of tax farming and high-interest borrowing in gold. They could not print money to finance their wars. They had to tax the peasantry. This fiscal rigidity strangled the French state. When the monarchy faced another debt crisis in the 1780s, after financing the American Revolution, they had no system to save them. They could not issue paper. They had to call the Estates General. That decision, born from the inability to manage debt, triggered the French Revolution in 1789. In a very real sense, the guillotine that fell on Louis XVI was sharpened in the chaos of 1720. The Mississippi bubble remains the ultimate cautionary tale of financial hubris. It demonstrated for the first time on a global scale the terrifying alchemy of speculation, the ability of human belief to conjure wealth out of thin air, and the inevitability of reality to turn it back into smoke. It showed that when the state itself becomes the speculator, when the printer of the money is also the gambler at the table, the ruin is not just financial, but political. The empires of economics are built on trust, and as John Law found, trust is the only asset that, once spent, can never be printed again. And that is how the first modern financial bubble didn't just bankrupt a kingdom, it set the stage for the fall of the monarchy itself. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Mississippi bubble, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And let me know in the comments, do you see any parallels between John Law's system and our economy today? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empire we analyze. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.